Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today we are going to be covering research methods. So, we're kind of transitioning from the first part of the unit, when we talked about the history and perspectives of psychology, to now we're going to be talking about the second part of the unit, which is more focused on the types of studies that psychologists use. We're going to spend 2 days talking about experiments, we're going to talk about statistics, and then research ethics before we round out this unit. Um, so let's get started. And then for the second half of this video, we're gonna talk about how to write an FRQ because you're gonna have your first FRQ workshop in which you're practicing writing an FRQ. I'll get back to this FRQ practice when we talk about the FRQs. So let's get into it. Remember our first day of class, we talked about how, your horoscope can predict your behavior. It can explain your behavior. So why is this not psychology? We said it's not psychology because it's not a science. And remember that in order for something to be a science, you need to have evidence and you need to have research done. So today we're going to focus on, how we conduct that research in psychology. And we know that this all comes from the scientific method. And the first part of the scientific method is you need to have a hypothesis. And remember, a hypothesis is just, if you take in any science class, it's that testable prediction. If I change X, then Y will happen. That if-then statement. Right? So it can be as simple as, if I go outside, then I will be cold. Right? We need evidence to prove that that's the case. I can walk outside right now and I will probably prove that. And then we'll know my hypothesis is true, right? We need hypothesis is just your kind of educated guess. And then you conduct research to see if it's, accurate or not. And we know that if it's not accurate, then you're going to go back and kind of revise accordingly. All right. So, difference between hypothesis and theory, two kind of similar terms. You can think hypothesis is just kind of your initial guesses, kind of smaller scale. Once you test several hypotheses and kind of put those together, you can form a theory, which is a well-tested and evidence-based explanation for a psychological phenomena. So, right, you can't have a theory without any evidence to prove it. So we need to have several hypotheses that have been proven in order to build that into a theory, right? So I put several proved hypotheses form a theory. So an example, I talked about this with perspectives, Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory, this idea that we have this pyramid of needs that we need to meet in order to reach our full potential. So here's some example of hypotheses, right? Like, if a person has all their needs met, then they'll be psychologically fulfilled. If a person does not have their belonging needs met, then they will not be fulfilled. Right? If you maybe Maslow went and tested all these hypotheses, conducted actual research, did the scientific method, whatever, found that these are true, put these all together, and form that evidence-backed theory of his hierarchy of needs pyramid. Right? So theory, you got to put all your testable, proved hypotheses in there. But what we're really talking about today are the different types of research methods or studies that psychologists conduct. And remember, also on the first day when I had you draw that picture of a psychologist, a lot of you either put a therapist or you put some dude in a lab coat. And I think this has to do with experiments. We think like a laboratory experiment that you're conducting. But we know there's plenty of other research. Experiment's going to get 2 full days that we're covering on it, so I'm not going to go in depth into this today. But we know an experiment is the only thing that can prove something as cause and effect, that a change in X causes a change in Y. The rest of these things are going to be correlational research methods, which are still valuable, but you can only see that 2 things are connected and related, but not necessarily know for sure if one causes another. But these are still valuable because you can, again, find that association. And then if you want to study it further, if it's possible, then you can do an experiment on it. So we're going to look at case studies, surveys, naturalistic observations, and then kind of you can differentiate those between longitudinal or cross-sectional studies. So let's get into it. I'm going to go through each of these ones I just mentioned. I'm going to describe what they're all about and how they work. And then I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each one. And AP Psychology is moving more towards IB Psych, which I taught for my student teaching, in which they're really wanting you to evaluate the research method and talk about like what are the strengths, what are the limitations that come along with doing each of these types of research methods. None is perfect, and that's why it's kind of good to do a whole lot of different types of research when you're looking into a phenomena. But yeah, they're gonna potentially ask you to evaluate like what is a limitation, like maybe they'll give you a blurb about a research study on an FRQ. And they might ask you to like say what's a limitation or something wrong with this. And you can always pull up some of your pros and cons that you came up with for each of these research methods to say like, well, like we know it's correlational, so you can't prove causation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so before we get into each of those research methods, I do want to mention the difference between correlation and causation more in depth, just in case we aren't aware of this. So like I said, causation is a relationship between two variables in which a change in one causes a change in another. You know that they're directly connected and that one is causing the other. And this can only be found in an experiment. Correlation is that two things are related. There's a connection, there's some form of relationship between these two, but we don't know if it's necessarily that one's causing the other. There could be something we call the third variable problem, in which there's actually something else going on that could be actually causing these to be connected. So we don't know for sure that there is a causation. We just know that they're connected somehow. So let's take an example of like I'm Italian and I like pasta. Is that causation? Is the variable of being Italian causing me to like pasta? Um, right? I'd have to conduct an experiment and make sure there's no other variables at play in that. Oh my gosh, my kitty's going crazy. But correlation, right? It's most likely a correlation at this point that, being Italian is correlated or associated with liking pasta, as I'm doing the Italian hands. Right? So there's an association, they're connected, but does being Italian cause you to like pasta? We don't know. There's probably other variables at play, such as like, that's just what you were raised with and whatever, right? So you'd have to do an experiment to prove that. So another thing to note, and just remember forever and ever, just top 10 thing to know in research method, only an experiment can prove causation. So if you see a test question and it says, blah, 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 so-and-so conducted a survey and looked at these things, and then it asks you something about like, is there, and that, or it says like, oh, the researcher said that this proves this, or this causes this. You can say, no, that was a flaw because they didn't conduct an experiment, so they cannot prove causation, because only a laboratory experiment in which you control all the variables can prove causation. Another thing, just like we did with the psychological perspectives, it's important to look at the key terms for each type of research method. Like I said, if you're on an FRQ, it's important to lay those buzzwords in, because an AP reader is going to look and see that you were asked to talk about correlation, and you mentioned, oh, there's a relationship between these two things, an association between these two things. Ding, you get your point. They're going to look at that and be like, they're good to go. And same thing, multiple choice. If it's saying like talking about a research method and you're asking to identify which one it is, if in the question it's saying something like, oh, they found a relationship between blah and blah, you can be like, they said relationship. Ooh, it's a correlation. Another important thing to note in terms of correlation is something called the correlation coefficient. And this is saying how strong of a relationship there is between two variables. So like I said, being Italian and liking pasta, is it like really strongly correlated in that like there's really like you can really confidently see like, ooh, the look at the line, it's like very clearly showing that like if you're Italian, like it's most likely that you're gonna like pasta. Or is it like, oh, it looks like there's an upward trajectory in that, like, most people we're surveying that are Italian like it, but like it's not super strong is what we're seeing. So it's looking at the strength, and this goes between negative 1.0 and positive 1.0 is the correlational coefficient. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk about these graphs here. So if something's a positive correlation, it means that when one variable increases, the other increases as well. So take my example of being Italian and liking pasta. So it's showing that variable one is being Italian, and it's saying that as that increases, as you're seeing, um, the more that people are Italian, um, the other one's increasing, which is liking pasta, right? So that's a positive correlation showing that the more, if you're Italian, the more you're going to like pasta. Negative correlation is the opposite. So it says that when one thing increases, this is also called inverse correlation. So it says that when one thing increases, the other decreases. So maybe it's saying that, and probably this isn't what actually is the case, but for the example, that it would be the variable of being Italian increases, you're going to see a decrease in the amount of people who like pasta. So it would say that there's a negative correlation or a inverse relationship between being Italian liking pasta, and that when one increases, the other decreases. So the more if you're Italian, it's saying that the odds of you liking pasta is going down. And then no correlation would mean that there's no connection at all between these two variables. So, right, the scatter plot, you don't see any connection. They're all over the place. So it's just scattered. There's no connection. So that means that in my example, there's no relationship between liking pasta and being Italian. So let's go back here. And we said that correlational coefficient is the strength of the relationship between these two variables. So if it's negative 1.0, that means it's a negative correlation. And if it's closer to the negative 1.0, it's really strong. So if it's negative 0.9, negative 0.8, or negative 1.0, that's like a super, super strong negative correlation. That like Italian pasta, like not gonna like no. You're not gonna like it. But if it's like a negative 0.1, negative 0.2, then it's like, okay, they're associated, but it's not like super duper strong relationship. There's like a little relationship, a little connection, but it's not that strong. Same thing, but in terms of the positive side, 1.0. So if it's closer to 1.0, so if it's like 0.8, 0.9, that would mean there's a really strong positive correlations, right? It's very, very strongly connected that if you're Italian, you're liking pasta. And then, 0 would be in the middle, kind of towards that no correlation. All right, we can see that displayed here nicely. But we see sometimes there's things like it's not always going to be the case that just because two things are connected doesn't mean they're causing causing one another, or that they're even like meaningfully related. Sometimes there's something called a spurious correlation. There's a whole website dedicated to these that are kind of funny that proves that correlations can be meaningful, and maybe you want to look into them more, but sometimes they're just flukes and we don't know why. So we have here, there's a correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool. And this is a positive correlation, right? Because as one's going up, the other one's going up as well. So number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and the number of films Nick Cage appeared in. So we see positive correlation between as Nick Cage appears in more films, more people are drowning by falling into a pool. Again, right, this isn't going to be causation. It's probably just a random spurious correlation. Then we also have per capita cheese consumption correlates with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. So again, these two things are positively correlated, but right, it's not meaningful. There's probably something else causing this. So what we see here, an issue with correlation, is that sometimes we have something called the third variable problem. So when you're trying to see if one thing is causing another, it might look like X is causing Y, but the reason why we need to have a laboratory experiment to make sure that that is truly the case, that X is causing Y, is to rule out any other variables. You want to control everything, control all your variables in an experiment to make sure that there isn't some third variable or like other thing in the background that's actually like interfering with your results and actually might be causing X to look like X is causing Y, when in fact there's some other third variable like Z, which is causing this relationship. So let's show an example. We have a recent survey by the Institute of Scavone found that people who eat ice cream are more likely to get sunburn. So, right, this research is trying to say that um, eating ice cream is causing you to get sunburn, right? Because we see there's a correlation that the more you're eating ice cream, the more likely you are to get sunburn. There's a positive correlation that more ice cream equals more sunburns. But we know that's not causation, right? Because we have the third variable of the sun, right? It's actually the sun that is causing you to eat more ice cream, and it's the sun that's causing sunburns. It's not ice cream that's causing sunburns. So that's what you call the third variable. When there's actually something else that's, causing this to look like there's causation between these two things, but it's really this third variable that's messing with it. We talk about, is this a statistically significant relationship, or is it due to chance? We see that a lot of these things might be due to chance and not actually like a meaningful relationship. All right, so now we're going to get into the different types of experiments. And we're going to talk about what they are, look at the key terms associated with them, because we know those buzzwords are important to reference, and then talk about the pros and cons. So we said laboratory experiment. No. That a laboratory experiment is the only one that can prove causation. So an experiment in which you have highly controlled conditions where accurate measurements are possible. So you can make sure that there isn't some third variable of the sun that is messing up your results and making it look like one thing's causing something when it's not. Because you can control and make sure that there's no other variables that are going to interfere here. So some key terms to note is that manipulation of variables, because you are manipulating it as the experimenter. Causation, cause and effect. And then there's other parts of an experiment, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, which include random assignment, controller experimental groups, single double blind. All that stuff would be things that you need to do in an experiment. So if you see those talked about, you can be pretty sure that the type of research method being used is an experiment, because they're not going to be doing these things in other research methods. So pro of a laboratory experiment is that it's the only one that can prove causation. That's like the big ding, ding, ding one that you need to know. And with that, it's the only one where you can manipulate the independent variable to measure the dependent variable and the change in that. You can control for other variables like the sun to make sure they're not interfering. And you can do random assignment, which makes it fair so that you're not having bias within your control and experimental groups. But the issues are that sometimes, because you're conducting this in like a laboratory setting, and not in the real world where you're doing like naturalistic observation, just watching people in their natural habitats, they're kind of artificial conditions, and you might not be able to generalize to the real world because people might be acting differently in a lab than they would in real life. And this also means low ecological validity is like the same thing I said here. That's the fancy way of saying that it's not really like real life. A lot of you talked about that. So I said, if Curtis came into my class, I would act different. I would try, I could try to act like a good teacher, but I would try and act even better. And you guys would try and act like even better students because you're being watched. And you also talked about the issue with introspection and self-report data is that you might try and sound more desirable in a survey or something, or might not be truthful fully. And this is what demand characteristics is, or the Hawthorne effect, in that you might guess what the experimenter wants and kind of like act like that. You're just trying to please the researcher. You might try and guess what the experiment is and act accordingly. You're trying to, act a certain way, which isn't how you'd normally act. Expectancy bias is when the experimenter unintentionally encourages participants to respond a certain way. And again, this is another thing that could come up that could alter your results. Confirmation bias, in which the researcher that's interpreting the results might pay more attention to things that support their hypothesis and not pay attention to things that go against it, and that could alter results. And then we also know that an issue with an experiment is that you can't do an experiment on everything. So an example, because there might be ethical issues. So for example, maybe I want to see if, eating some weird chemical will cause cancer. I can't ethically perform an experiment in which I'm giving someone something that could possibly cause cancer, right? So there's only certain things that we can ethically study in experiments. So an example here. So I'm just going to give you some different things to look at for each research method. What we see here is one that a lab experiment testing whether self-esteem, the independent variable, has an effect on attraction, dependent variable. We'll read through here, but you can see that this idea that they're looking at an independent variable causing a change in the dependent variable makes it so it's an experiment. Okay, next is a case study, and this is an intensive study of a person or a group. And typically, it's some kind of person or small group that has something really like unique or obscure happen to them that we want to study. Like, we're not just studying any old person, it's probably someone that had something unique about them that makes it so psychologists want to study them. Some key terms you can associate with this would be in-depth, rare, intensive, thorough, detailed, one person or a very small group of people if they talk about that. Right? So the thing about a case study that's good is because you're only studying one person and you're doing a battery of different things. You're interviewing them, you're observing them, you're doing tests on them and surveys and stuff. You get really, really thorough, descriptive data about them. And they're really good for understanding like weird things that happen, like damage to specific brain parts, or like really rare psychological disorders. Because going back to that issue with an experiment and the ethical concerns, one famous case study has to do with Phineas Gage, who had a pole go through his head and through his frontal lobe and damaged it. So it allowed researchers to see what the frontal lobe really does and how damaging your frontal lobe might impact your behavior. This was really cool for psychologists, not great for Phineas Gage, but he lived to tell a tale. But cool for psychologists because they could see, what happens when the frontal lobe's damaged, right? Because I couldn't ethically conduct an experiment in which we're having people damage their frontal lobes and then trying to see what happens, what the change in their behavior is. So it's good for these things, but the issue of case studies is because it's only like one person usually, it lacks generalizability, meaning that it's hard to apply your findings to the larger population. Because, okay, so this was Phineas Gage's experience with a pole going through his frontal lobe. How do I know that if Joe Schmo also got a pole through his frontal lobe, is that how he would act, right? It was just one case. It's hard to generalize and say that this is true to everybody that this would happen to. They also take a long time. Like, you're observing this person for a long time. So it's timely. You're not going to get your results right away. It could be subject to researcher bias, in which the researcher is only looking for things that can support their hypothesis and might be ignoring things that go against it. It's also hard to replicate. An important part of research is having it be replicable so that someone else is saying, confirming, like, yes, I got the same findings. And you can't really replicate ethically because, again, a case study, you have to wait for these every once in a while rare occurrences to happen. So, right, you might not have another person have damage to their frontal lobe for another 50 years. You can't replicate those findings. So, a fun way to remember case studies, I think of it as like reality TV shows in which you're like looking at one person. Like, there's one that I keep seeing. It's like this girl who had cancer at a young age, and now she has like the body of like a child, but she's like 22 or something, right? So that's like a case study. You're looking like in depth this reality show of this one girl. Um, so I kind of think of it like that. But another case study would be Jeannie the Wild Child. She was a feral child who spent the first 13 years of her life strapped to a high chair. And um, the researchers found her, or they eventually rescued her from this like terrible situation of neglect and abuse. But the psychologist kind of used her as a case study because she couldn't speak any language. She never learned English. She didn't know any language. So they tried to use her as a case study to see, like, can you learn language after that kind of like period you typically would in your young childhood. So kind of used her as a case study on language and socialization. Okay, next method is a survey. And this is basic, right? It's using questionnaires or interviews. They could be open-ended, they could be multiple choice to collect data and information. Key terms, obviously, questionnaire, correlation, association, poll, anything like that. We know a survey is easy, right? It's so easy just to send out a Google form and get data. So you can get really large sample sizes, which we talked about, and being able to generalize to the greater population. That's awesome because you have data from a lot of people from a variety of backgrounds. So you can generalize better. So you can get large sample size. It's really quick and easy to do. It's also cheap. You don't have to pay much money to send out a survey, especially if it's online. But the issue, like we said before, with introspection and self-report data, you can't fact check it. How do you know that they're telling the truth? Things are subjective. There might be response bias in which you're not answering honestly. Memory lapse, right? Maybe you just didn't remember accurately. Sometimes you can have biased questions that might cause you to answer a certain way where you're not really getting the right answer that people want because it was just worded weirdly. And as always, any correlational method doesn't prove causation. All right, so an easy example is Hofstede was looking at creating his theory of cultural dimensions. So he sent out a questionnaire to people from different countries in the world, asking them how they perceive their work environment. And from this, he found that there's different values in each culture that help influence people's behavior and cognition. Right? He sent out a questionnaire. Okay, now we've got... My cat is freaking out because there's a giant bug on my ceiling and now I don't know where it went, and this is scary. Okay. So naturalistic observation. This is one that I said it's kind of the think of the nature documentaries. Like we're watching the kitty in her natural habitat here. Right, so it's a research method in which the psychologist observes the subject in their natural setting without interfering. That's the key thing here, is that they're observing them, but they're not interacting, they're not interviewing them, they are just watching them do their thing. So key terms: watching, observing, no interference or interaction, natural habitat. It's very realistic. So the pro of this is that, like we mentioned, the issue with the experiment that I said is it's not very authentic. They're kind of artificial and not very generalizable to what goes on in the real world. So we said that a naturalistic observations, kind of the opposite of this. It's super realistic. You're seeing how people actually would interact. They're probably not, especially if they don't know that they're being watched, they're going to be engaging in authentic, truthful behavior. So this would have high ecological validity. And again, it's not in a laboratory, so it's like real human behavior. Cons. So it cannot determine causation, just like any other experiment, because you can't control behaviors. Also, in the case that if they do know that they're being watched, like they know that you're watching them play with toys or something through a little mirror or something, like a window, um, they could potentially act differently. So it depends on if the case is that they know they're being watched or that they don't know they're being watched. Ethical concern, and then if you're not telling people you're watching them and they're part of research, right, that can be controversial. So here's an example of a naturalistic study. Psychologist by the name of Wood wanted to see if children were more likely to play with toys related to their own gender. They had 15 toys in a straight line in a room, 5 stereotypically boy toys, 5 stereotypically girl toys, and then 5 kind of gender neutral toys. During the play section, they watched the children and looked at the amount of time the kids and adults played with gender specific toys, and recorded that down. And the results showed that parents and kids spent more time playing with gender specific toys. Right? So this is naturalistic observation. The kids, they're not necessarily at home, like they were probably brought into a lab to do this, but they're kind of in that natural environment in that they're playing with their parents, they're playing with toys, they're just being watched doing this. They're not being interacted with. Okay, then there's the last ones are longitudinal versus cross-sectional studies. So these are kind of how long your study is going on for and what type of groups you're using. So if you're doing a longitudinal study, and these are often used with developmental psychology. If you're doing a longitudinal study, you are looking at one group of people or a person for an extended period of time to observe changes in the long term. So, right, this would be connected with developmental psychology, in which maybe you're trying to see how we change cognitively throughout our lifespan. So, you're looking at like the same group of kids, you start them in the experiment at like age 5, and then you follow them all the way till death. Like you're trying to see how they change cognitively throughout their life. So key term is anything about a long time or having the same participants. So good thing about longitudinal study is that you have the same participants throughout the entire study. So it's like that's a pro in that you're not changing people. And like obviously if you change people, like they might think differently and whatever. So it's good to have the same people. And it allows you to see changes over time and generations, which is really cool. It also provides rich data, and since it's the same kids studied over time, participant variables, in that changing the people is not influencing the results of the study and creating kind of a bias or that kind of third variable. A con, we said, is this is really time consuming, right? This is like observing people potentially throughout their whole life. So you're not going to get the results for a really, really long time. And that's also expensive if you're having to like bring these people back all the time and do that, right? Another issue is that people could drop out. And right, because if you were signed into this as a child, you might get older and be like, I'm not going to do this, or people die or whatever. And then the issue could arise is the people who are dropping out, are they meaningfully different than the people who are staying? Right, and that could create a bias as well. So here's an example. We got a study on nuns. So Dr. David Snowden did a longitudinal study on a group of nuns in 1986 at the School Sisters of Notre Dame in the U.S. to learn more about the effects of aging and Alzheimer's. Made research check-ins on them up until their deaths. The homogeneous lifestyle of the nuns made them an easy and ideal study population. They were non-smokers. They drink little any alcohol, have the same marital status, reproductive history, lived in similar housing, similar jobs, very similar all around. So there's not a lot of third variables out there, extraneous variables that can confound or impact like the results here. So it's longitudinal in that right there, looking at these nuns aging for a long period of time, as long, up until their deaths. Cross-sectional studies addresses the issue that longitudinal studies, while really cool and valuable, take a long time and have issues. So cross-sectional study is kind of a way to do this type of research, but saving time and kind of energy. So a cross-sectional study looks at a cross-section or a specific group of the populations and studies them at one point in time rather than the longitudinal, which is doing check-ins throughout their lifespan. So we see here, you might grab a group of people. If you're trying to look at cognitive differences throughout your lifespan, you might grab a people who are age 30 to 40, then another group at the same time who's age 40 to 50, and then another group who's age 50 to 60. And these are all different people. So you're not seeing like, oh, Billy Bob Joe, age 30, checking in 10 years later, age 40, checking in 10 years later, age 50. It's all different people, but you're grabbing these large groups and kind of checking in at them at one point in time. Ooh, oh my goodness, this bug came. It's big. It's big. She's going to eat it. Oh my gosh. This is really dramatic, you guys. This is really dramatic. Hold on. She's gonna kill it. I'm watching. Guys, can you see this? This is really. We are watching. This is a naturalistic observation of the cat in her natural habitat. Oh my gosh. It's coming towards me. I'm gonna leave. Oh my gosh. Get it. Get it, girl. Do your job. Do it. Oh no, is it on the oh. Oh no. She fell. This is so chaotic. Oh my gosh. Wow, that's the most exciting thing that ever happened in my video. So, back to cross-sectional studies. We said the pro is that they're cheap, they're quicker, there's less participant dropouts because they can't drop out. It's all happening at one point in time. Right, so addressing all the weaknesses of the longitudinal study. But the issue, obviously, is what it lacks is it's not longitudinal. So you can't analyze behavior over time because it does use different participants to represent the different age groups rather than the same people over time. This means you can't be absolutely sure that there's not some third variable or some kind of difference between these groups because of their generational gaps or whatever that are not due to, participant variables or like another third variable or something. So here's an example of a cross-sectional study. Bayrick and al. Carried out a cross-sectional study to demonstrate reliability of memory. There are about 392 participants, aged 17 to 74, that were tested. Some participants had been out of high school only 2 weeks. And at the other end of the continuum, some of the participants had graduated 57 years earlier. Right, so we see the different groups at that same point in time. Participants had to test their memory of how many people they could remember in their high school yearbook. Right, cross-sectional because it's one point in time. They grabbed all these people to do this research, but it's different age brackets at the same time. So there you have all your research methods. And I put in here, and kind of just if you want to look back and get like a really quick memory cue to remember what the pros and cons are of each different type of research method, I have that all here. All right. So now let's get into how to rock your FRQs 101 so you're going to be feeling like you're the champion at the end of the AP exam. Okay. So just a reminder that we do have 2 free response questions that are 50 minutes for both of those, and this is a third of your exam score. One is going to be concept application, which is very similar to what I had you do with your friend Anul for the intro questions today, in which you had like 5 terms, which were all the different perspectives, and you were asked to connect how they would apply to the situation that you were given with Anul and whatever was going on. So you're defining the term and you're applying it to the scenario. There's always going to be another FRQ, which is based on research methods. And this one's not the same where you're defining and then applying the term. It's more just straight like you're answering. You're looking at, they give you a little blurb and probably talking about some kind of like research experiment that's going on. And then you have to do different things in terms of research methods, like identify what's the independent variable, what's the dependent variable, You have to do things like operationally define the variables. You have to talk about what the control or experimental group is. So different things like, oh, is this an experiment? What kind of research method is it? So these are the two types. So that's why I spend like so much of this unit talking about research methods, because we can guarantee that there is going to be a FRQ on research methods. So when it comes to FRQs, first thing to note that I think is really nice, some people are not writers. We don't like to write essays and papers and things. Others of you are. That's fine. But this is great because FRQs, it's like if you like to just be concise and get to the point and like be done with it, this is for you. You have to write in full sentences, but there's no intros or conclusions. Like you're not actually writing like an essay type thing. You're literally just like writing, like getting straight to the point and answering what they're asking. And you don't need to introduce it. You don't need to conclude it. You just go boom, 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 boom. I'm going to answer it and then I'm done. So let's go through and look at what FRQs are all about. So we're going to first look at some examples of the concept application FRQ, and then we'll look at some research methods ones. So this is from 2019. We have a senior in high school. Ludi worked as an assistant to the children's librarian in his town library. He enjoyed shelving the books in the library because he was able to work alone and focus on his tasks. Although the library was normally a quiet place, sometimes the children's section became quite noisy when groups of children visited. After working an unfulfilling desk job for 30 years, Ludi recalls how much he enjoyed working at the library and decides to go back and work as a volunteer creating new programs for disadvantaged children. So remember, this is the part where it's actually telling you what you need to do. Describe how each of the following concepts relates to Ludi's return. This is a nice prompt because it's really just giving you kind of free reign. Just find a connection between how each of these terms would like apply to Ludi. So for each of these, you don't need to have an introduction. You don't need to have a conclusion. You just get right to it. So define what crystallized intelligence is, explain how this term would connect to Ludi. It'll be about 2 to 3 sentences for each term. So you'll define it, kind of give an example of what it is, and then apply it to this scenario. And the only thing you score points on is the application. They don't care about that. They want you to define it because that's just kind of the structure, but they don't score your definition. They only score that you applied it correctly. So really focus on being clear and that you're demonstrating your knowledge of this term in your application. So each of these, you'll put a break in between. So if you're like writing it, you'll, have 2 to 3 sentences, kind of a paragraph break. Then you'll go into altruism, define, example, apply it back to the scenario. Again, there's no intro, there's no conclusion. You're just kind of having these little baby paragraphs that are about 2 to 3 sentences each. Oh my goodness. About 2 to 3 sentences each. So now here's a research methods FRQ. So again, it's not so much to define and apply, you're more answering questions that they're asking you. So we see here, they give a blurb. They said researcher compared effectiveness of massed versus distributed practice in preparing for a memory test. 2 groups memorized definitions of 40 vocab words. Group A, there were 30 participants, all under the age of 25. Participants in Group A used the method of distributed practice. Group B did mass practice, blah, blah, blah. So right there's just your blurb about this. So they're going to ask you questions. So what was the operational definition of the dependent variable? You don't need to define what a dependent variable is. You just need to answer the question. You still should write in full sentences and still kind of treat it where it's like a sentence or 2, paragraph break, then answering the next thing. But you don't need to do the whole definition thing. So just answer what it's asking you. Say the operational definition is blah. Paragraph break. Now this one. The ethical flaw is blah, blah, blah. You can correct this by blah, blah, and blah. So let's get into it. So like I said, you get right to the point. This is kind of how the structure here, so pay attention. You are not doing an intro or conclusion. They waste your time. They waste the reader's time. No one wants to look at that. It's just fluff, and there's no point. So you're going to use the strategy of define, example, apply, DEA. But like I said, the most important thing is the A, it's the application. So define the term, right? Explain, in this case, what is crystallized intelligence in a sentence. Provide a general example. This is something that on the AP exam you don't need to do, but as we're starting out, I think it's helpful because it helps you kind of get in the mindset of applying it. So you can kind of provide a general example of, like you would in that third vocab column, of what the term is. So I'd say crystallized intelligence is intelligence of like facts and like vocab, and this is something that increases as you age. An example of this is why elderly people like to do crossword puzzles and play Jeopardy, because their crystallized intelligence of like facts and things increases throughout the lifespan. Apply the concept to the question. Well, Ludi's working in a library, so he'd use crystallized intelligence of like having like, doing all the reading, getting facts and stuff. He'd use crystallized intelligence and like knowing the Dewey Decimal System and like where everything is, and just reading books and things, right? So apply it back. And then you'll make a new paragraph, rinse and repeat for the next thing. So let's go back to our friend Anul and that first, the intro questions I gave you, right? So he's been having trouble fitting in at school. He moved from Pakistan to Ohio. His mood's down lately. The pressure's getting to him, but he's trying to get everything to fall in place. So, right, apply these terms and how the perspective would explain Anul's behavior. So let's give our example. And I basically had you do this in your intro questions. It was tedious, but it's an example of what you're going to do. So let's see, I define biological approach, perspective that says our behavior is due to biological and genetic processes and neurostructures like parts of the brain. For example, a biopsychologist would use the biological perspective to look at the role of a neurotransmitter like dopamine in analyzing a patient's behavior. And now I'm going to, important part, apply it back to Anul. Psychologists using the biological approach would say Anul is an adolescent and has hormones that are fluctuating, therefore causing the change in his behavior. Some just good tips is read the prompt and then make sure you're looking at what it's asking you to do. So like I said, go back, and this one's just saying describe how the concepts connect to Ludi's return, right? Make sure you know what it's asking you to do, because sometimes it is asking you different things. Sometimes it's saying explain how each of these terms would either help or hinder the person in this scenario, right? And that's different than just connect or apply the terms, right? It's asking you to do something more specific. So make sure you know what it's asking you to do. Go with what you know first. Right, you don't want to waste time on writing about things that you're not confident about that you might not score a point for. So, answer the things you know first and then go back. And then, right, defining the term is kind of what you're going to do first. And then it doesn't need to be elaborate. And we know that definitions don't score, so don't waste your time spending a bunch of time doing this. But this is something that they like to see. All right, so here's another one. Right, here's your define. Amygdala is part of the limbic system that regulates emotions like fear, anger, aggression. And then give your general example. So like I said, it's something that's not required in AP, but can help show a reader your understanding of the term and potentially aid a weak application. So here's this one. So Purvik and Nisha spent a summer day at the amusement park. They rode roller coasters. Explain how each of the following might have played a role. So I defined what amygdala is. And then I gave a general example, like for example, the amygdala would be activated if you're entering a haunted house. Boom. Then you're going to apply back to the term. Make sure you're simply not parroting the terms from the prompt or definition, because that's not going to score. You need to be really specific and use synonyms of the definition, so you can show the reader that you clearly understand beyond just a Google search. Right, so here's some examples of why we need synonyms. So a bad application would be Luke used observational learning by observing his brother's behavior, right? That's like you're just parroting or repeating the definition. If I said Luke used observational learning by watching his brother's behavior and then mimicking or mirroring or copying the behavior himself, right? I use synonyms to show that I understood it without mimicking the prompt or the definition. So here's my application for Pervik and Nisha. I said, in this scenario, Pervik and Nisha, their amygdalas would be activated when they feel afraid while riding a scary roller coaster that's very tall and fast. Step 6 is something that you can do if you have extra time. And this connects to this idea of knowing the keywords or the buzzwords connected to vocab terms. And this is something that just shows your knowledge and can really like show a reader like, dang, this person knows what they're talking about. So underlining those kind of key terms that are connected to the vocab term they're asking you to apply. Because this is something that as an AP reader, I would do if as I'm reading your guys' FRQs and like when I grade, I go through an FRQ and if I see someone's talking about the amygdala and then I see the words fear, aggression, anger, I would like underline that and then you just read through it and you get your check that you scored the point. So if I see that a student underline those terms, like that's really showing me like, dang, they know what they're talking about. So again, that's not going to like score you a point or anything, but like it's again showing the reader that you're confident to know what's going on. Right, so they underlined afraid and scary in this one because the amygdala has to do with fear, anger, aggression. I'm not going to spend all this time going through past FRQs, but I have a whole doc in which I linked past AP prompts with rubrics and examples. And it's just a good idea to look through the past FRQs because you can kind of get a sense of what they asked for. And a really good way to study vocab terms is to kind of think like, okay, how could this be applied to a FRQ? Oftentimes FRQs ask you to say how this term would help or hinder someone. So you can kind of look at vocab terms and be like, oh, how could this be helpful to someone in this scenario? How could this hurt someone in this scenario? Often they ask you FRQs are about like typical daily life situation, like, oh, a lot of them are about school. A lot of them are about studying for a test or like a sporting event, or you have to, you're going on stage and giving a performance. So they're kind of about like daily life things that happen. Last year's was about a kid playing video games. So you can kind of get a sense for what they're all about. So it's like, you feel confident going in them. Right, so here's just some quick examples. We see the help hinder, right? So Jackie's been chosen for a lead in the school play. She's both nervous and excited. Part A, explain how the following concepts would help her. Part B, explain how they would hinder her and not help her. We see this again. This was my AP exam in 2014, right? How would these help? Let's see. Right, how might these help or hinder Abram? Sometimes they're more generally applying, right? So Ludi, just describe how they connect to the prompt. Another one, give an example of how each of these could affect their performance in a dance competition, right? More general. Right, so we see things like this. Annabelle's applying to college, but didn't know where to apply yet. Describe how the following psychological terms would relate to her choice. Another one we see, explain how each of the following is related to the decision to buy a home. So all these things. So anyway, that was a lot of stuff. But your homework for tonight is an FRQ workshop in which, oh my goodness, Kitty, oh my goodness, an FRQ workshop in which you guys are applying the perspectives to a scenario. So we said one of the unique aspects of science of psychology is that psychologists often use different approaches to explain an example of thinking behavior. These different explanations can complement each other, providing a more complete answer rather than being contradictory. Use the following psychological approaches or perspectives to explain why a child might cry when frightened. So again, you're going to define each of these terms. You're going to give a general example of them and then apply them to the prompt. This is a formative grade, so I'm not grading you on if you actually got this right in the rubric, just grading to see that you actually put effort in and did this. And then you'll peer review and grade each other's according to the actual AP rubric, which again will give you some insight into like the perspective of what a reader is looking for. So that's your homework tonight. Write this on paper because this is what, when you write the actual AP exam, it's on paper. So get practice writing it on paper. All right. That is all. Thanks for joining me and have a great rest of your day.